please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Well, let's go straight to the top story tonight. The United States of America has escalated its trade tussle with China even further. Days after tariffs on Chinese imports worth $34 billion came into effect, Donald Trump has gone ahead and dared China yet again, this time with a 10% tariff on Chinese imports worth a whopping $200 billion. Kyla Touche joins us now. Kyla, another day and another tariff threat.
The U.S. upped the ante on tariffs after saying that China simply wasn't responding to the previous tariff levels. Now trade officials are threatening $20 billion in new tariffs in the form of 10% charges on $200 billion in Chinese exports. The list unveiled yesterday includes handbags, leather goods, and many types of apparel. Asked how the White House would limit the impact on U.S. consumers of a package that includes nearly half of all Chinese imports, Peter Navarro pointed in June to the 10% tariff level instead of 25%, saying that that would limit the impact. Oxford Economics has said the U.S. tariffs alone, notwithstanding future investment impact, would shave 0.2% off GDP next year. Overnight, China pledged firm and forceful measures to retaliate, but hasn't said exactly what those are, since it buys less than $200 billion in goods from the U.S. It called the U.S. move bullying and says it will fight this at the WTO. As for the timing of the U.S. move unveiled last night, a senior administration official denies that the rollout of the list right before the president met with NATO allies with whom he's trying to negotiate various trade issues. He denied that there was a connection there and said that actually the U.S. and its NATO allies are trying to work together to fight trade issues with China. So we'll see whether, in fact, that comes up in the conversation or whether this is, in fact, seen as a warning sign to Europe.
Kyla, appreciate you joining us with the details. After a cheerful mood at the start of the week, global markets have crashed sharply. The sharp dip in sentiment follows the publication of the list of goods that make up that $200 billion worth of U.S. imports from China that may be subject to a 10% tariff. On Wall Street, the Dow is now seeing triple-digit losses and currently down by about 0.7%. The S&P 500 and the Nasdaq are also trading about 0.5% lower. Wall Street taking cues from Europe, where the losses are in fact much steeper. The German DAX is down 1.6%. The French CAC and the British FTSE are also down over 1% each. Nothing different in Asia, where all benchmark indices ended with sharp cuts. The Shanghai Composite lost nearly 1.8%. The Hang Seng in Hong Kong and the Japanese Nikkei were all down over 1% each. Our markets closed flat. And it's not just China. The U.S. president spoke at Brussels before the NATO summit, accusing Germany of being a captive of the Russians. And in response, the German chancellor has said that Germany makes independent decisions. German defense minister also spoke on the issue and said that they can cope with repeated criticism from Donald Trump. Trump is all set to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin after the summit. Iman Zavez is in Brussels tracking the NATO summit. Iman, so this is now getting even more interesting. President Trump going after Angela Merkel in Germany.
A contentious start to the NATO summit here in Brussels, Belgium today. The President of the United States, Donald Trump, beginning the session with a breakfast with Jens Stoltenberg. He's the General Secretary of NATO. And at that breakfast, President Trump coming out swinging against the Germans, criticizing that country for an energy deal with Russia that he feels pays money to Russia and disadvantages American taxpayers. The president, in effect, saying the Germans are hypocrites for accusing the president and the U.S. administration of wanting a close relationship with Russia at a time when they're deeply enmeshed in an energy deal with the same country. That sets off a tense day today here at the NATO summit and throughout the rest of the week. And of course, that shadow looming over this entire summit is the meeting next week in Helsinki, Finland, between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. NATO allies here worried about what could happen today and also at that summit next week. In Brussels, I'm Eamon Javers. Now back over to you.
Iman, appreciate you joining us. And another CNBC TV18 news break confirmed the Telecom Commission has approved the National Digital Communications Policy of 2018. The new policy framework focuses on the digital transformation of the telecom sector, aiming to provide broadband connectivity to every citizen. The Telecom Commission has also given its nod to the net neutrality rules that bar telecom companies from discriminating against internet content services. Ashmit joins us now with the details. Ashmit, this has been in the making. It's got the approval today. It is now pending cabinet approval. Take us through the fine print.
Well, indeed, the national telecom policy, envisaged as a game changer for the telecom sector, has today been approved by the Telecom Commission. Now, why is it significant? What are the features of the NTP? Well, one of the reasons it's significant is because it is the NTP that envisages, that seeks investments of nearly $100 billion over the next 4 years. It also talks about ensuring adequate availability of spectrum and realistic pricing of spectrum. That has been a constant complaint of various telecom players, that the pricing is too high. The NTP also talks about rationalization of various levies. Speaking of the stress in the sector, that has also been a demand by the sector, that there should be a rationalization of levies. It also seeks indigenization of R&D and manufacturing, recognition of the sector with an infrastructure badge. That has also been a long-standing demand of the telecom sector, as well as smoother M&A. Now, while we speak of smoother M&A, what's interesting is that the DoT secretary in the same breath also pointed out that she confirmed, in fact, that there has in fact been a demand slapped on Vodafone and Idea, that the ball is squarely in their courts to decide whether they want to comply, whether they want to pay up or move the courts. That's completely in their court. But she also said that consolidation is in the interest of the sector. So a slight divergence there, but nonetheless, the Telecom Commission, having approved these recommendations, they will now fall before the cabinet for their final approval. So on that note, at least a step forward as far as the NTP is concerned. But again, the DoT secretary confirming as to the status of the demand and that the ball is in the court of Vodafone and Idea. Back to you.
Okay, Ashmit, hang on. It's the second day in the hearing of the case against Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. The provision criminalizes sexual activities against the order of nature. The government submitted its affidavit, playing it safe and leaving the decision to the wisdom of the 5-judge bench. But it has cautioned the apex court against expanding the scope of Section 377 to civil rights, inheritance, marriage rights, among others. Ashmit, you've been in court today as well. The centre has played it safe. It's refused to take a stand on homosexuality and basically said that the wisdom of the court will prevail.
Well, to begin with, on a lighter note, in the year 2013, when the judgment had come out, that was the time that the apex court had put the onus on the government to take a decision by way of legislative means. This time around, we have a U-turn of sorts where the government is now telling the apex court that we're not taking a decision either for or against Section 377. It falls squarely on the shoulders of the Supreme Court to decide as far as the constitutionality and legality of Section 377 is concerned. But while the government hasn't taken a final position as far as 377 is concerned, they have been very, very clear before the apex court that should the apex court go beyond Section 377 in deciding at rights that flow to the LGBTQ community, that is something that the apex court should be wary of, and that is something that the government will then deliberate upon and come out with a considered view. The apex court, of course, as of right now, confining the proceedings only till Section 377. Another aspect that needs to be highlighted was an interesting argument that had been put across by 20 IIT students who had moved the apex court. Their counsel, in fact, questioned the apex court as to how strongly must one love to be able to withstand being an unconvicted felon under Section 377. The council also said that some of these brightest kids of the country are in fact facing a sense of despondency, despair and desperation. And in response to this, we had some interesting observations. Justice Chandrachud observed that a homosexual couple walking down the Marine Drive in Mumbai should not face harassment or discrimination. The chief also said that this 150-year-old provision now needs to be done away with. So the broad tone and tenor of the apex court is now beginning to take shape. But of course, a final decision is awaited from the apex court on Section 377. Back to you.
Ashmit, appreciate you joining us. India's public sector decision-making is paralyzed. That's the word from the outgoing Chief Economic Advisor, Arvind Subramaniam, speaking at an event in New Delhi. A very candid Chief Economic Advisor went on to list reasons why he believes India's bureaucrats are afraid of taking decisions due to what he calls over-stigmatized capitalism. Speaking about the public sector banks, the CA lamented about the lack of reforms over recruitment, which he believes has diminished their risk-taking capacity. Listen in.
I think that what stigmatized capitalism is doing in India is that you will get more role for the private sector in greenfield and in terms of entry, but greater private sector role for in kind of taking over existing public sector assets is going to confront the stigmatized capitalism problem, because you know the political authorities will always, and public sector bureaucrats will always come under this cloud of, you know, you sold this asset, did you do it in some kind of sweetheart deal? And I think we've spoken about the the pall of the 4C problem that hangs over. So public sector decision making has been completely paralyzed by this, and something similar. So, see, when you said, I think it's not quite right to say that, nothing has come on, because Air India was on the block for a very long time. But I think that, again, a version of stigmatized capitalism, I think, has kind of taken over. And I think that, these decisions second guessed in the future is something that still creates. Now, the interesting thing about this IBC, I think I want to, again, do a mea culpa by way of explaining something, is that, see, I was early on in favor of a bad bank, right? But then the IBC happened, and I've come to realize and accept and acknowledge that the IBC was the more realistic way forward because of stigmatized capitalism, and in the following sense, that when a bad bank would have given the lead role to the executive and the political process, and they've been in the front line in terms of these negotiating what has happened with, so I think, okay, so I think a consequence of stigmatized capitalism is that more and more decisions will be taken by the judiciary, because they are seen as the most kind of, legitimate and fair kind of people to take this decision. So if you've stigmatized capitalism and you're not sure either about the private sector or about public sector regulating the private sector and all of this, I think you're going to see more and more of this quasi-judicial or really explicitly judicial way of disposing public sector assets. We have to have more private sector participation, but I think for three new reasons. The old reason is, politicians interfere with resources. That's still true, but that also happens to private banks in India. So I think we have to be thinking. But I think there are three new reasons why I think we should have more private sector ownership. One, I think this whole 4C problem, the pall hanging over good decision making, I think you get out of the public sector, you have that one. Second, I think that this is kind of the new point, which is that the public sector is just enormously handicapped in terms of their ability to recruit people.
The tenure, all the management.
So public sector banks really don't have very good risk assessment capability. I mean, and to be fair to them, it's not because they are bad or inefficient. They just can't recruit. So I don't know whether I mentioned this last time. If I'm repeating myself, forgive me, that in my first year here, Raghu invited me. He was governor. He invited me to come and give the convocation at NIBM. Now, NIBM is an institute, training institute for bankers, run by the RBI. So after the convocation, Raghu and I were chatting, and Raghu said the irony is we pour resources into this. No public sector bank can come and recruit at NIBM, because public sector banks can only recruit through the bank exam process. So this is kind of a ridiculous situation that we're in, that we put in public money and we can't do this. And so those restrictions that happen, I think, are the second reason. The third reason, which again is that we have found in the last 10 years with this, that public sector lending to private sector lending is so toxic. Getting out of it is so difficult that we don't want to repeat this going forward. So I think that therefore, and then there's the other reason that Governor Urjit Patel says, is that when you have public sector ownership, it complicates the regulator regulating public sector banks.
Well, that's a very candid chief economic advisor there, saying that the decision-making at public sector banks and in the public sector has virtually come to a grinding halt, and that is because officials fear being called out for what may be eventually be seen as a sweetheart deal, this in the context of decisions like disinvestment and, of course, this business of public sector banks lending to the private sector, which the chief economic advisor says has become toxic. And the need for the private sector is imperative, but will that happen or not in an era of, as he calls it, stigmatized capitalism is something that needs to be watched. The group of ministers on sugar cess met today, but it did not firm up its view on the matter. The panel will meet again on the 20th of July, a day ahead of the next GST Council meeting, to finalize the decision. Sources tell us that the GOM believes that the urgency of imposing a sugar cess has now reduced. In fact, the panel may consider the possibility of a 1% cess on luxury goods instead. This could be used to create a fund to tackle agricultural distress. This comes on a day when the outgoing chief economic advisor has called for a simpler GST and direct tax structure. Listen in.
Fewer rates, a wider base, fewer exemptions. I think those principles are absolutely, I think fundamental in that. And I think on the GST, therefore, it's kind of a work in progress on that. I think we need to simplify that a little bit more. On the direct tax side, I think we are, Arvind Modi is heading a committee where, again, I hope some of these principles will be adopted, where we have much simpler tax structures, and that's one. The second principle, I would, and this kind of relates, and maybe we can come back to that, I do think that, for example, when you have fiscal targets, I think this having targets and having to meet them, I think it's something that does give rise to perverse incentives, and I think that's something that I think we need to watch out for. You see, but the third principle I would say is essentially, which I laid out, is really try and use more, incentives rather than punitive actions to this. The problem, of course, is that when you have stigmatized capitalism, right? When you have stigmatized capitalism, you in a sense almost have to go overboard in order to establish the legitimacy of the state, to say, look, we are, even holier or better than that in going after the bad guys, right? I think that's just the legacy of stigmatized capitalism. And I don't know whether, in doing that, how you can actually minimize the collateral benefit in that. I think minimize damage is going to be very difficult.
A simpler GST and direct tax structure. That's the word in from the Chief Economic Advisor. Coming up next, a CNBC TV18 exclusive report. The government not in favour of diluting powers envisaged for the auditing regulator, the National Financial Reporting Authority, or NAFRA. That when we return. The government is not in favour of diluting the powers envisaged for the proposed auditor, the National Financial Reporting Authority. That is the new watchdog the government is putting in place. Timsy Jaipura joins us now with more details. Timsy, what are you picking up?
As you rightly mentioned, government is not in favour of diluting the powers that have been envisaged for NAFRA in the draft rules that have been put out by MCA. Also, auditors and chartered accountants, remember, after this draft came out, had raised concerns, and they are in continuous talks with MCA. But what government feels as of now is the fact that they are not in any favour to dilute these powers. Also, discussions on these draft rules are still going on. So government wants that NAFRA should be a body which should give enough space for ICAI as well. But yes, when it comes to regulatory powers, when it comes to the mechanism that NAFRA should have to monitor CAs and auditors, that is going to be very strict. Government feels that there needs to be a stricter regulatory body. They need to have proper SOPs in place so that auditors and CAs don't mess up with the system. Also, remember, government feels that NAFRA and ICAI, which is a big fear for these auditors and for the CAs, that ICAI will lose their powers. That's not the case. Government has clarified to CNBC TV18 that they would have independent space to work in the future also. Remember, MCA has been pushing for stricter rules. NAFRA as an authority has been delayed quite some time, and now we feel that this authority will come in place very soon. Also, NAFRA has set in a code of conduct for auditors and CAs, which will be very crucial to watch out for as once government puts out the final rules and regulations, because CAs feel this code of conduct is going to be very strict on them. So let's see what actually comes out in the final draft. But yes, as of now, government in no mood to dilute the powers that are envisaged.
All right, Timsy, that's an important story. Thanks very much for tracking that for us. But on to another CNBC TV18 special. India's quest for a dedicated data protection law continues, with the Justice Sri Krishna Committee likely to submit its recommendations for a draft bill maybe over the next month or so. There is no clarity on that. But how accountable are citizens for their own data, and what are you missing out on by not reading the terms and conditions of a website before consenting? Kevin Lee finds out in the third installment of Data Wars.
Do you remember the last time that you actually went through the terms and conditions of a website before clicking on the agree button? If you don't, then you've probably saved a lot of time. You see, in 2012, a study was conducted to see how much time you would have to spend reading all of these terms and conditions for all the apps and websites that you use in a year. And the answer was 76 full working days. So do companies actually expect you to go through all of these documents before clicking on the agree button?
Companies using Google's advertising services know that I'm a male between 25 and 34 years of age. They also know that I'm a video game buff who's partial to action and adventure games, that I enjoy rock and jazz music, and that I watch a variety of television shows. How do advertisers know this information? Because years ago, while signing up for a Gmail account, I clicked on a little box that gave Google my permission to share this data with third parties. And over the years, this permission has extended to YouTube, Google Maps, Google Search, and even my Android device. Google's privacy policy is a 20-page document with close to 100 hyperlinks leading to different documents. So did Google really expect 18-year-old me to peruse these carefully before consenting?
It is not very easy for individuals to make these choices in the way the notice and consent is being done today. If you read the agreement that many of these websites and applications ask you to sign, it is very difficult even for a trained lawyer to figure out what is it that they are agreeing to in these agreements.
It is perhaps in recognition of this that the European Union's landmark data protection law, the GDPR, seeks to hold companies responsible for the simplicity of their terms and conditions. Companies collecting the data of European citizens are now required to seek their consent in simple English. In the run-up to the implementation of GDPR, however, European citizens reported receiving thousands of emails from companies every day. And while the language may have been simpler, the net result was the same: citizens accepting these terms to avoid flooded email inboxes.
With GDPR coming in, they have to actually become extremely sensitive, because the penalties for breach of data and using data without the user's permission can be pretty severe. So I think I do agree that some of the advertisers or the publishers may have gone overboard.
An alternate suggestion is a platform that ranks the privacy policy of websites and apps through a simple rating system to notify users of how secure or dubious those policies are. But experts argue that ultimately the buck stops with the person consenting to these terms.
All this can only help me take the right decision. Ultimately, the decision should rest with the users. I think some part of the privacy debate in India has become gone into the territory where people are saying that individuals may not be able to make the choice for themselves, so therefore some third-party regulator has to do this for them. I think that's a little bit of a dangerous territory.
All things considered, it might be a good idea to at least skim through these terms and conditions before clicking on the accept button of any website or service. However, simpler privacy policies are only one small part of this landmark data protection law. What are the other details? Tune in tomorrow to find out. In Mumbai, Kevin Lee.
Well, with that, it is time for us to wrap up this edition of What's Hot. Thanks very much for watching. Up next is Markets Today, where we speak with the CEO of TCS. That and more when we return. I'll see you in 30.